This is the Tree of Life, Season 18, Chapter 8. In this episode, we will be talking about sequential substitution events and the spatial coordinates of substitution events. To start out, in the last episode, we talked about how in reverse substitution events the negation follows the acquiescence, whereas, in regular substitution events, it precedes the acquiescence. In other words, the transitionary period, describing the overlap of two streams of perception, reveals the substitution event. When it is a reverse substitution event, the transitionary period reveals that one's consciousness is no longer in one's vessel, such that one's self-perception and objects of consciousness appear to have linear continuity, despite this continuity not being authentic. Thus, one may be driving down a street in New York, in another vessel, whilst one believes they are driving down a street in London, in their own vessel. In a regular substitution event, the bifurcation relates not to the vessel, but to the objects of consciousness. In this case, the vessel remains linked to the self-representation, but the objects of consciousness or context of the vessel is distinct from the perceived objects of consciousness. For example, one may believe they are playing a video game at home alone, when in fact, they are having a conversation with someone they know very well in their kitchen. Now, substitution events and reverse substitution events can be sequential. If there is negation both before and after the acquiescence, the result is a sequential linking of a substitution event and then a reverse substitution event. In this case, the transitionary period may reveal in the first case a disconnect between a person's objects of consciousness and the vessel's context, but not their self-representation from their vessel, followed by a complete disconnect between the objects of consciousness contextual to the vessel and the vessel itself. Sequential substitution events in this fashion result from conflicting natural law by authority, that is, distinct hierarchies, and tautological natural law. In this example, the first negated impulse results from one set of natural law by authority, and the second negated impulse results from a second, whilst the acquiescence relates to tautological natural law. In other words, the negation in the first case results from a proprietary experience channel in relation to submission to some authority. The negation in the second case results in a second proprietary experience channel producing submission to a second authority, with dialectical impulses. Now, in past episodes, we talked about different ways that the temporal coordinates of substitution events can be determined by different systems. We talked about how these coordinates largely relate to when we negate our natural impulses, and in what circumstances. Sometimes, these temporal coordinates are determined by conventionality, tautological natural law, and sometimes by authority, natural law by authority. In this episode, I would like to explain how the spatial coordinates of these two forms of substitution event are determined. You must first conceptualize, or stretch out, one's behavior in a linear fashion. If you examine your behavior carefully, you will see that you tend to go to particular locations for rest. These locations represent the release, or acquiescence associated with the movements corresponding to the rhythms of our motion. Just as in a movement of an arm or a leg, the release of that motion and return to its resting state and position represents a movement of the attention. Thus, these spatial locations where we repeatedly return in the larger sense, for our periods of rest, center us within a place free of negation, or negational valence. As we saw in recent episodes, it is negational valence which produces strings of parallel analog and digital structures. So long as we move to satisfy our comfort, by not resisting through negation our discomfort, we remain within the tautological natural law. Since we saw that negation of two orders produces substitution events, that is, in negating a movement or rhythm, the natural flow of our movements, centered in this rhythm free of negation, limits these temporal coordinates, or displaces them from our behavior. So, the spatial coordinates of substitution events largely center around where we repeatedly return to states of rest. Not the location themselves, but displaced from that location. The spatial coordinates of substitution events are locations, where we resist our impulses repetitiously. The locations and times where we move naturally with the flow of comfort in the alleviation of discomfort, not in negation, but in acquiescence, are the opposing pole. Thus, this opposing pole may be locations such as a chair we always use to read. Or it may be our bed. Or, it may be that street corner where we usually stop our run late at night. The other pole is locations where we frequently negate our impulses. Such as locations where we are afraid, or inhibited. They may be at a church we go to. Or that street corner where we always fight the urge to discontinue our evening run. That's the end of the podcast for today.